Part 3. Steal My Crown. Chapter 30. Lone Wolf. To be a great wrestler, you have to be a real athlete and a great actor. To be a great champion, you need to be the best storyteller of them all, because your job is to work with the top hands, whoever they are. Whatever his opponent's age, size, skill or style, whether he is a heel, big face, Olympic-style shooter, showman, big brute or clumsy oaf, the champ has to have the versatility to bring the best out of each contender. A champion needs to be a champion first to his fellow wrestlers, and to protect and honor the profession for their sake. Or at least that's the way it used to be when I was involved in pro wrestling. Even without the belt, I wanted to play this role and leave my mark on the business for years to come. My formula was simply to outwork and outwrestle my competition. And I would never stab backs. On the other hand, champion wrestlers tend to hold on to their power like despots, and I shouldn't have been so bitter toward Hogan. He was only guilty of being as greedy as he felt he'd earned the right to be. When I realized that my WrestleMania 9 check was 10 times bigger than the biggest check I'd ever got before, I wanted to dip my cup in two and never stop. Vince McMahon's previous torchbearers, Hogan, Macho and Warrior, had made so much more than the rest of us all those years. Throughout that summer of 1993, Yokozuna was the man. He sat in his first-class seat stuffing his face like Henry VIII. Lex Luger was in first class too, a perk left over from his old World Bodybuilding Federation contract. Back in coach, I tried not to let it bother me, but it did. I put Lex over without complaint. Although he was a mechanical worker who stuck to the basics and stayed there, he was a pro, safe, agreeable and easy to work with. I hoped maybe Vince would change his mind and put the belt back on me, but Lex was the one who got the SummerSlam match with Yoko. Hogan was playing hardball in negotiating his contract, and I found out later that Hogan was being pressured by the feds to roll over on Vince. Subpoenas were being served right and left, and I was sure to get one too. Vince went to work repackaging and building Lex to be his next superstar. First he erased the narcissist, then dressed him in skimpy red, white and blue trunks and turned him into his new all-American hero. The face turn was accomplished by having Lex slam Yoko on the deck of the USS Intrepid in New York Harbor on Independence Day. No one had ever been able to slam Yoko, not even Hogan. Vince loaded Lex into a red, white and blue bus christened the Lex Express and with much flag waving and hoopla sent him off on a heavily hyped promotional tour, all summer long, across America. Vince couldn't have done more to get Lex over. I continued to be called upon to put Lex and Yoko over at house shows. I found myself toying with the notion of going to WCW, which was still throwing buckets of money around to all too eager former WWF stars. They'd been turning up the heat with improved TV production too, but they still didn't have the hang of it, and their stuff came across, as Vince liked to say, like a wrestling show. Their house shows were improving, but they didn't draw despite having some exceptional talent, Sting, Vader, Pillman and a muscled-up Chris Benoit, who looked like dynamite and was working like him too. There was also a guy from Texas with long, blonde hair by the name of Stunning Steve Austin, who impressed me a lot. WCW never did much with him, and I thought if he ever became available Vince should snatch him up fast because I'd really work well with him. The biggest war the wrestling world would ever see was heating up, but this time Vince wasn't steamrolling over small-time promoters such as my dad. He was taking on Ted Turner, with all of his arrogance, business savvy and billions of dollars. McMahon and Turner poked each other in the eye every chance they got, upstaging each other's pay-per-views, screwing each other out of arena bookings and raiding each other's rosters. The WWS house show business had been down, but the return matches between Yoko and me were drawing Vince some of the biggest houses he'd had in years. Meanwhile, wrestlers who came over, such as Kevin Nash, joked that back in the WCW they were still only working in front of empty chairs. Yoko was no longer that humble kid who'd shuffled his feet and blushed when he told me that he'd be honored just to be in the same ring with me. Now he was king shit. I understood all too well that the belt can do that to you, and I knew it wasn't his fault. Yoko was agile for his size, and like every Samoan wrestler I ever knew, he was a hard worker. When he ran out of gas, I took the action to him so he wouldn't need to move around too much. I bounced my fists off his sweaty head while he rolled his eyes, panting and giggling like a little kid. He'd come off the ropes for his big leg drop, and my head would disappear under his fat thigh with the crowd gasping out of fear. The truth was he never, ever hurt me with it, but afterwards the imprint of his red nylon tights would stay tattooed on my face for days. Then Vince had me job out to Mr. Hughes, a rookie who was as big and black as he was stiff and green, and I felt I had no choice but to take a good look at my contract. I found out that it rolled over on December 31st and that, if I wanted to jump to WCW, I'd have to give my notice by September 30th. In pure sports you win or lose based on ability, but in pro wrestling, even if you're the best, your credibility can be won and lost in no time at all with the stroke of a promoter's pen, if you don't stand up for yourself. I was still Vince's biggest star, especially in Europe, so I had a good hand in this poker game. As Vince pushed Lex and Yoko past me, I kept my cards close to my vest and my head down through what would be one of the most grueling and difficult WWF summer schedules ever. Each time I got home I'd train tan and play touch football with Dallas and his friends over at the schoolyard. Then just 2.5 days later, I'd find myself plopped down next to Owen as the wheels of the plane tucked themselves underneath us and we headed out on the road again. And we'd compare notes on the goings-on at Hart House. One time that summer I'd stopped by to find my mom upset and crying in her office. Stu sat across from her with his glasses pushed up on his forehead, his lips pursed and the tip of his tongue sticking out, as he fidgeted with his hearing aid. My mom hesitated to tell me what was wrong until I insisted. As a result of the last few years of Stampede Wrestling, and a few bad investments that were nearly broke. Although Stu couldn't hear us, I had the feeling he knew what we were talking about. When he left the room for a moment, my mom told me, "We've done a few things with our savings that we shouldn't have." Stu came back and she lowered her voice, adding, "It would break his heart to tell you." I told her not to worry, I would always be there for them. Owen was angry that Bruce, Ellie and Smith were ceaselessly burdening our parents with their money problems, and I figured that this is what my parents had been doing with their life savings, bailing them out. Owen had given up all hope of ever making it as a top wrestler and was anxiously awaiting news about getting on with the fire department. I reminded him that being a firefighter carried certain risks and that maybe if he hung on a little longer things would improve. I'd nearly thrown in the towel back in 1984, when my fate suddenly changed and the wrestling business saved me. He gave me his little kid grin and said, "Nah, I'm ready to go home." I told him to hang on until after the SummerSlam '93, when I thought I'd be in a better position to speak up for him. That was when I expected to play my hand with Vince and press him to reevaluate and renew my contract. I was going to gamble that he couldn't afford to lose me, especially since WCW was the last place I really wanted to be. I often spoke to Roddy Piper on the phone. He told me that, although it was clearly a long shot, making action films in Hollywood was the next plateau for me to hit. He stressed to me that I should pressure Vince for control of my Hitman name while I could. I was one of the few wrestlers who actually performed using my birth name, and nobody could ever take that away from me, but Vince could afford to fight for years over my ring name if I split from the WWF. With a long build-up for me and Jerry Lawler at the SummerSlam '93, I was disappointed to hear that Stu and Helen would be unable to attend the pay-per-view. Stu had finally relented to undergo long-overdue knee surgery. He'd never had bad knees, but in a bizarre mishap, while receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award from WCW in Atlanta, he tripped getting into the ring, blew out his right knee and had to be carried back to the dressing room. After a show in North Tonawanda, New York, near the end of July, I walked into a trendy bar with Carlo and stumbled right into Shawn Michaels, who was busy insulting a young woman. When she answered him back, he grabbed her face and gave her a good shove, which triggered a bunch of guys to surround him, jostling for the right position to kick the hell out of him. Diesel, his pretend bodyguard, stepped in for real. One guy held a broken glass and another inched in closer, hiding brass knuckles behind his back. Neither Shawn nor Diesel had seen the brass knucks. I stepped in right behind the guy with the knucks and calmly said, "What do you think you're gonna do with those?" Eventually Diesel, Carlo and I backed the unruly mob away from Shawn. He had clearly been way out of line. Shawn's lip had sparked numerous dust-ups over the years. I remember him telling me how once he had been in a drunk tank down south mouthing off to a bunch of cops, who then proceeded to open the door of his cell and beat the hell out of him. These days, things were wearing on Shawn. He'd gone through a divorce, and on top of that he was worrying about an upcoming court case, resulting from when a TV jobber named Chad Austin was paralyzed in a match with the Rockers in December 1990. Unlike his cocky, boy-toy persona, the real Shawn was often insecure and emotionally fragile. I could tell by the bloody tips of his fingernails, which he nervously chewed on, that he was heading for a breakdown. Shawn's problem, as with so many other wrestlers, came when he mixed downers with alcohol and either forgot who he was or thought he was somebody else. Luckily for him, Diesel, Razor, a host of fellow wrestlers and I were never far away. I was never sure whether the routine mixing of downers and alcohol was a case of wrestlers trying to kill their pain with drugs or kill their drugs with pain so they'd have an excuse or justification. Shawn and Razor were among the worst, but in those years they also lured into their fold Sean Waltman, a young up-and-comer known as the 1-2-3 Kid. Seeing them wasted and passed out in bars and restaurants after the shows made me fear one of them would be the next Rick McGraw. Razor noticed that more and more I preferred to go off on my own and nicknamed me the Lone Wolf. I didn't want to travel the road they were on. On August 12th in Calgary, I ran into Davey at BJ's gym and I was taken aback at how huge he was. Obviously WCW wasn't drug testing at all. He happily told me that there was a good chance WCW might put the world belt on him soon. Later that night, Davey and Diana were at a Calgary rock bar, where an obnoxious drunk was going around goosing women. He'd been told twice by the bouncers to stop. When he groped Diana, she warned him that her husband was the British Bulldog, but it only seemed to egg him on. It wasn't long before a rocket-fueled Davey had snatched him in a front-face lock and choked him out by leaning back and lifting him right off the ground. When Davey released the hold, the drunk fell backward, smashing his skull like a glass jar of pickles on the cement floor. There was a flood of blood. The bouncers, who knew the guy had been asking for it, ushered Davey and Diana out the back door, and they fled the scene. The guy from the bar was in a coma for 32 days and was never the same after that. And Davey found himself embroiled in a costly legal battle just when things were starting to look up for him. The following day, I had a long meeting with Vince at Madison Square Garden. While I thanked him for my WrestleMania 9 payout, I told him I felt frustrated with the direction I was going in. Lex was never going to get over, especially with the Wrestling Observer ripping him apart for his mechanical work rate. In Vince's usual evasive way, he switched trains on me, telling me that he needed both Owen and me to work a couple of shots down in Memphis for Jerry Lawler's struggling Mid-South promotion. I pointed out that Vince had refused to allow me to help my father when Stu was in the same situation, saying he couldn't afford for me to get hurt. Vince assured me that if Owen or I were injured in any way he'd take care of us as though we were working for him. I only agreed because I needed Lawler to work with me at the SummerSlam. On August 16th, Owen and I arrived in Memphis. As our plane landed, I thought back to the day that Elvis Presley died, when I had a dream that the world was ending. In my dream, I sat on the back steps of Hart House with Owen, Ross, and Georgia, all of us serene as we waited for the end. The western sky in front of us was lit with a deep red mushroom cloud that drifted toward us. Behind us, framed by a pale blue sky, lay the quiet innocence of Calgary. Owen and I headed down to the Mid-South Coliseum, where we were to work a tag match against Lawler and Jeff Jarrett, the son of wrestler Jerry Jarrett. Jeff was about Owen's age and size. With long blonde hair and thick legs, he was working a gimmick for Vince as a rhinestone cowboy country singer called Double J. Despite all the dirty deeds the fans had seen Lawler do on WWF TV, in Memphis he was still a beloved babyface. Memphis had always been the most insane outpost of the goofiest and funniest types of wrestling and wrestlers, going back to the 1960s, when promoter Nick Gulas and his son, George, ran the territory. George was the all-time worst example of a promoter's kid going over all the time, beating everybody when he couldn't beat his own pillow at night. He'd cry out, "Daddy says go down." Jackie Fargo, Mr. Pogo Lawler and Honky Tonk were all born from this hillbilly territory. Jeff Jarrett was one of the rare exceptions from Memphis who could work. Lawler had the biggest crowd in years, more than 5,000 wrestling fans hollerin' and hurlin' garbage at us. Owen and I saw a whole new relevance to the old joke. What has 100 legs, 3 teeth and an IQ of 30? The front row of the Mid-South Coliseum. The ring made the worst rings I'd ever been in seem like featherbeds. It had wired garden hoses for ropes, and sharp bolts jutted out beneath the padless, cloth-covered turnbuckles. The patchy old ring canvas had little or no padding underneath. As heels, Owen and I snatched the house mic and borrowed from a combination of Cool Hand Luke and Deliverance. What we have here is a failure to communicate, followed by me twisting Owen's ear while he squealed like a little old pig, spoofing the hillbilliness of it all. We had a great time working the fans up and went on to have a fabulously phony match with Lawler bleeding, pleading and crying in desperation, reminding me a lot of the televangelist Jimmy Swaggart. Owen and I made faces, cussed and wiggled our asses as we wound up our punches like Dusty Rhodes. By the end the fans were fixing to fetch ropes to string us up. Lawler was more than grateful. Owen and I actually looked forward to going back 2 weeks later for a return cage match. The day after that cage match, I'd work with Lawler at the SummerSlam 93, if I didn't trip and kill myself in his pathetic ring or get lynched by hillbillies in the parking lot. Those 2 Memphis shows would end up being some of the most fun that Owen and I ever had in the ring together. I had a bad flu when I worked the SummerSlam 93, but there's no such thing as too sick for a pay-per-view. Everything was centered around Lex and Yoko's American Hero angle. Undertaker was expected to carry Giant Gonzalez again, and like with so many horrible workers he'd been saddled with, he made a silk purse out of a sow's ear. As for me, the Hart family had now been written into my storyline. My mom and dad had been in the audience at Monday Night Raw, and Lawler took to ridiculing them with a series of one-liners, "Hey Stu, I heard you wrestled when the Dead Sea was only sick." By the end of it, my mom pretended to be in tears. Even Stu's legit knee surgery was said to be the result of Lawler having shoved Stu in the stairwell as he was leaving the building. Owen and Bruce sat in the front row, representing the Hart family, dressed in their finest Western wear. Owen was bummed out because he'd just learned he'd been rejected by the fire department. His dream of a happy home life was put on hold, and again wrestling was all he had. My match had a great storyline that Pat put together, only he didn't tell Bruce about a rib they had planned for him. As I stood in the middle of the ring, Lawler hobbled out on crutches, grimacing with each step. Bruce and Owen did an interview from the front row, blaming Lawler for Stu's knee injury. Lawler explained that he was on crutches because he'd hurt his own knee in a car accident, and as badly as he wanted to whip me, Doink the Clown, Matt Bourne, would wrestle for him. Of course, the Hitman went ballistic when Doink came out. He was carrying 2 pails and made out to the fans that they were filled with water, but when he hurled one at the crowd, they were relieved to find it was filled with confetti instead. As Doink got closer to where Owen and Bruce were sitting, it looked like he was going to dump confetti on them too. Totally caught off guard, Bruce took a pail of water right in the face while Pat and Vince rolled with laughter backstage. Owen had caught wind of the rib before the match and had warned Matt that if he got a drop on him he'd rib him back for the rest of his days. This was a serious threat because Owen was a serious ribber. Matt managed to soak only Bruce. Matt could work when he wanted to and built up terrific heat. Soon enough I had him twisted into the sharpshooter, with my back to Lawler, who crept up behind me, revealing to the fans that he really wasn't hurt at all. He hit me across my face so hard with his crutch that I was worried he'd split me open. I was furious that, once again, he seemed to enjoy being dangerous. Writhing on the mat in real pain, I decided to make him pay for every bit of it. Lawler knew he'd hurt me and gave me some working kicks before fleeing the ring. Jack Tunney, who was still playing the role of figurehead president of the WWF, appeared in the aisle to tell him that the people had paid to see him wrestle me and that since he wasn't really hurt he had to turn around and have a match or face permanent suspension. The crowd was on fire as I busted my way past a half-dozen refs to get my hands on Lawler. It was payback time and he was in trouble. It had been 2.5 months since he jumped me with the scepter at King of the Ring, and it still hurt me to take a breath. I unloaded on him, potatoing him with every punch, and soon he was jabbing me in the throat with a piece of broken crutch, working, building his heat better than any heel in the business at that time. He punched and kicked me, pulling every dirty trick he could think of, until I rallied with another stiff, full-force comeback. When I stepped into the sharpshooter I almost bent him in half, for real. He begged and pleaded for me to ease up, but it was payback time. The ring filled with referees and agents who pretended not to be able to pull me off Lawler. Many of them had trouble keeping straight faces as they actually leaned their weight on me. They didn't like him either. After subjecting him to 4 minutes of excruciating agony, I released Lawler, who was so pained he couldn't move. Keeping to the storyline, the ref announced that because I wouldn't release the hold, I'd been disqualified. Of course I became incensed and attacked a groaning Lawler as they carried him off on a stretcher. When I came back through the curtain I smiled as I watched Lawler crawling like an alligator to his dressing room. Singer Aaron Neville, who was there to perform the national anthem before Lex's match, laughed, shook his head and said to me, "You did a job on him, man." As I drove up to Grand Rapids TV with Owen and Bruce, I was in a good position to negotiate. I'd been subpoenaed and I knew it wouldn't sit well with Vince to have me testify while there was animosity between us. The first thing I asked him was why he couldn't do more with Owen. I pointed out that he'd never come through on his promises to Owen and that with the shortage of talent, it would be a damn shame to see him quit the business. Vince feigned surprise at the directness of my remarks, but after a few minutes he promised me he'd come up with something for my brother in the next few weeks. Then I told him I didn't like anything he was doing with me. I pointed out that as hard as he tried to paint over me with Hogan's and Luger's colors, the pink and black kept coming through. The fans weren't going to let me fade away. It wasn't fair that he still expected me to carry the shows and do the brunt of the work, while Lex got the belt and the top pay. If he didn't have anything big in store for me, I said, I was thinking of taking a year off. The color drained from Vince's face, and when I closed the door behind me, I knew I had him. Just before I flew to New York to testify at the grand jury on September 22nd, Vince's lawyers carefully prepped me. One even wrote me a note that read, if asked about the indictment, say it's absurd, that after nearly 2 years of investigating, the federal government would indict Vince on an alleged $530 steroid purchase from 1989 when steroids were legal. Vince's lawyers encouraged me to be honest, yet they counseled me on what was safe to say. I went into the hearing unafraid to tell the truth and braced for almost anything, but what went on in that room still falls under the legal cone of silence. Meanwhile, my lawyer, Ward Kirk, crafted a tactful letter to Vince, listing my demands for a better deal, including the rights to my Hitman name. He also reminded me that, should I wish to opt out of my contract, I needed to submit a letter of resignation to Vince by the end of September. If I decided to stay, I could rescind it. Even though I knew it was just legal maneuvering, that awareness didn't shrink the lump I had in my throat when I signed it. When Vince received it, the whole WWF office erupted into chaos. After the next TVs in Glens Falls on October 19th, I talked with Vince and Pat at a Holiday Inn bar until 3 a.m. I explained that I'd prefer not to go anywhere, and that all I wanted was a fair deal. I said I'd quit over it, and at last they believed me. The next day, Vince surprised me with a crazy idea for a storyline. He wanted me to have a falling out with one of my brothers, possibly Bruce. He'd grown jealous of me, so he'd challenge me to a match. I'd take the high road, refusing to fight my own brother out of respect for my parents. Then maybe it would be Owen who would step in and offer to face Bruce instead. Bruce would work against Owen and wipe the floor with him so badly that I'd have to come to Owen's rescue. The idea was that I'd eventually end up taking Bruce on at WrestleMania 10. Then, after all that, Vince would put me with Lex at King of the Ring in June 1994. But he hadn't made up his mind who'd go over. I felt confident enough that if it came down to a popularity contest between me and Lex, which it likely would, I'd win. I could imagine how devastated Owen would be to have Bruce beat him so handily. As badly as Bruce needed a shot in the arm, Owen was a better worker, and he really deserved this chance. I suggested that if I had a pretend falling out with any of my brothers, it should be with Owen. Pat argued that Owen couldn't handle it, and I suddenly realized that for all these years it was probably Pat who had kept Owen down. I had no idea why, but maybe Pat thought he wasn't big enough to make a huge impact with the fans. I insisted that Owen could do it, assuming I agreed to any of this. Vince raised his index finger as he ran it through his mind. Hold on a second, Pat. Maybe he's right, Owen would be just fine. I said I'd think about everything and get back to them in a few days. Afterwards, I told Owen what Vince and Pat had proposed. He actually loved the idea. He reminded me that it was a work and that this could be the break of his career. Why shouldn't he be able to make main event money working with me like anybody else? I told him there'd be no turning back. We'd have to do this old school. No more riding together, hanging out together. Never insult the fans' intelligence, make them believe it's real. And I reminded him, I'd have final say on everything. On November 7th, I flew to WWF headquarters to meet with Vince and Pat. I was happy to see the cartoon I'd given Vince hanging behind his desk. Vince joked that he was worried that I was turning into an Ultimate Warrior. I laughed and said, "No, I'm worried about turning into Tito Santana." Tito was a hard worker who'd been used up and pushed aside. Before I signed my contract, I wanted to make sure I had the rights to my Hitman name and the freedom to pursue acting, as Roddy had suggested. I'd recently agreed to let Carlo represent me, and he was bursting at the opportunity to get me into Hollywood. Vince agreed, which was a huge victory for any wrestler at that time. We shook on it, with Vince telling me that he and I had been friends for so long that we didn't need a contract. Our word was our bond. But days later, Vince sent me a 20-page agreement. It was even more controlling than the old one, and my lawyer told me I'd be crazy to sign it. On November 12th, J.J. Dillon called to say that Vince had signed off on my revised contract. The thought crossed my mind that a victory over Vince probably meant he'd fuck me somewhere down the road,